Spy, all things considered, is a goofy as all hell class. The idea of a stealth-based class in a multiplayer game seems really cool until you realize that said class only has like a few ways to trick the enemy, all of which you can learn in the span of a few minutes. Of course, staying hidden and stealthy is still a crucial part of playing Spy, but the truth is that very few of the common methods of sneaky Ryu sees today are the ones explicitly laid out for him by the game to the player. Disguises are incredibly tough to make work without deploying 9 million IQ gameplay. Staying invisible only works until the Pyro class decides to sneeze on his mouse 1 button, and even the Dead Ringer acts less like a death fanning item now and more like a oh cool speed boost item. Nowadays, I'd say the only item Spy has outside of his standard invis watches that encourages traditional stealth is our pal the Eternal Reward, or the Your Eternal YER for short. It's been one of Spy's most recognizable knives since its addition in 2010, and with good reason. Its most notable stat, the ability to steal the disguise of any backstab target, is incredibly cool and plays really well into the whole stealth vibe that Spy goes for. But it hasn't been the same over the years, or at least it was for a while. All the way up until recently in 2017, which was five goddamn years ago now, you were unable to disguise manually at all. Because of this, your only means of disguising was by backstabbing an enemy player, something that's really hard to accomplish without one. And after that, any attack that isn't a backstab brings you all the way back to square one. It was a tough weapon to use, but was both really cool in concept and had quite a few uses. It's uniquely powerful against engineers with sentry guns, allowing you to choose whether you want to stab and then sap at your leisure, without the worry of getting shot by the gun. The weapon's downsides also encouraged a difficult, yet satisfying and rewarding playstyle of stealth. Being unable to disguise manually forced players to be much more creative with their positioning and decloaks. As I mentioned though, the weapon received a rehaul in the ancient times of 2017. A few stats were changed, but the first one we'll discuss is the ability to disguise manually being added, albeit at the cost of a full cloak meter. This was a relatively controversial change, less so for balance reasons, but more so because it felt like it removed the identity of the weapon. It was hard to use for sure, but the uniqueness of having to find your own disguise in battle was really charming and fun in its own way. You really did feel like a secret agent spy man. So removing that aspect of the weapon by allowing manual disguises like other knives was largely considered to be a meh move by the community. However, I think there's more to it than that. While it is true that the former YER was much more unique in a few ways, I think this new version allows the weapon's much more subtle strengths to come out a lot more. With the old YER, there were a lot of situations in which it just wasn't as viable. If most players were inside of an active enough sentry, if players were actively spy checking enough, if maps were just wide open and didn't allow for good decloak spots. These are all pretty vague situations and can be worked around at times even without a disguise, but it often just wasn't worth the trade-off of just going with a typical knife that allows you to disguise whenever you need it. Now though, the YER is so much more viable in a lot more situations, and it lets us experiment way more with it. I won't go exactly into what I mean just yet, because that's got way too much nuance for this section, so let's move on to the aforementioned stat, requiring a whole ass cloak meter to disguise. On paper, it might feel like a pretty light downside. It isn't too uncommon to have a lot of cloak, and things like ammo kits are around plenty, right? Well, sort of, but not really. You do spend a lot of your time as spy with a full cloak meter, but the times when you don't are the times when you really need a disguise. Think of it like this. The deeper you are into enemy territory, the more likely you are to be low on cloak, since you'll be using said cloak to get in there in the first place. But at the same time, whenever you're in enemy territory, it is really important to not be undisguised. You'll get plowed by sentries, and any enemy that spots you will not let you go. This means you often have to choose one or the other, save your cloak to disguise and maybe get some work done, or keep your cloak ready to go invisible to escape or reposition if the situation calls for it. All this considered means you need to be really smart when it comes to managing things like ammo boxes and positioning around them. Your cloak takes a very long time to recharge, and waiting around doing nothing is pretty dangerous, so ammo pickups are your only consistent choice. Even that though isn't so simple because of one of the worst stats Valve has ever added to any weapon in this game, a 33% cloak drain penalty. Genuinely, if I could make any change to any one weapon in the game, removing this stat would be it. Like we've already gone over, using a full cloak bar for a single disguise is actually pretty costly, and without a full ammo kit around, you're essentially losing the ability to cloak for a solid few seconds or longer. This 33% increased cloak drain rate means that your cloak will be drastically lower on average than otherwise. Like, I'm not even talking about how much it limits your ability to move around while cloaked yet. This stat just means you're in a constant battle with your cloak meter, and that 33% drain rate doesn't even decrease the amount of cloak you have, just the rate at which it depletes, meaning it still regens at the same speed as if you had any other knife. And yeah, like I mentioned, it also makes your cloak time laughably short, severely limiting your options for getting behind the enemy while invisible. And good god, don't even try using the cloak and dagger with this thing. You have just 5 seconds of movement before having to stop if you don't want to get noticed. Because of this stat alone, you're almost required to equip the l'étranger when using the YER, which really sucks for a lot of reasons. For one, being limited on your options just discourages experimenting and trying out different loadouts, which always blows. Fans of the Ambassador, Revolver, Diamondback, and even all 4 of you Enforcer fans, I'm sorry, but you're out of luck. Even with the l'étranger though, while you do still have a slightly higher cloak time than with an all-stock loadout, you can't even make full use of the thing. The higher cloak time is nice and helps mitigate some of the garbage, stupid, horrible design decisions here, but the cloak gain per hit with the l'étranger is severely less helpful. Think about it, if you're running low on cloak in any situation and want to use the l'étranger to get it back, you're going to be undisguised while doing so, since firing drops any disguise you have. This means enemies will be on you like a hawk if they notice you poking at them. And even if you do manage to not get killed instantly, you're now at full cloak without a disguise. You now have to choose between running away with your cloak or using a disguise, immediately dropping your meter to 0 and leaving you vulnerable. It only really works well if you're deep within enemy territory with some ammo kits at the ready, since only with some help are you able to both cloak and get a disguise. And even if you aren't in enemy territory, why are you bothering to shoot enemies to regain cloak instead of just running to spawn or dispenser? It's a lot of weird logic to follow, but my point is, this 33% cloak drain penalty pretty much forces you to use a revolver that has just one use, to make your cloak drain rate at least tolerable. The other stat it has is even less helpful, and you're locked out of any other options you might want to try. It's kind of a weird rant, but in a video specifically about the Eternal Reward, I feel like it's time well spent talking about how one of its stats is really stupid and just doesn't need to be there. The full cloak lost on disguise is already a problem enough with a full ammo pack, considering you essentially need to have a full cloak in the first place to make use of it. One full cloak to disguise in the first place, and another to actually recharge your cloak to go invisible. Trust me, there is no world in which this thing is any kind of overpowered, at least if it's resembling any kind of its current form. But even with all this considered, it doesn't mean that this thing isn't still really fucking cool. So with a weapon as complex and on an even more complex class, it only makes sense that the exact strengths of this thing and how they benefit you follow suit. So I'm going to cover each upside of this knife one by one by extracting the ideas out of these stats. For one, and most simply, instantly disguising as the person you backstabbed often makes your disguises a lot more believable. With the other knives, you need to use game sense and habits to know which disguise to use and when, which ones aren't already of players alive nearby, and which exact position you should be in. There's a lot of complexities to it. The YER, however, does all this for you because inherently, you only get a new disguise of players exactly where they are and as what class they are. If you stab a sniper, you're probably already in the exact position a sniper would be, making you less suspicious. Same goes for engineers nearby buildings, and especially medics or other power classes nearby push spots. This also comes with the extreme upside of what I call natural performing. Whenever you stab an enemy, a lot of the hard work of faking a disguise is done. You're in the position as a class you should be, meaning this weapon railroads you right into acting like the class you're disguised as. You don't need to worry about what class to be and where, all you need to do is stab someone, act the part. Find someone else, stab someone, act the part. Rinse and repeat. It's honestly really hard to put entirely to words, but if you use this thing enough, you'll know what I mean. It's a really satisfying effect that just starts happening without you noticing. This benefit is hard to quantify as to how useful it actually is, since its effectiveness isn't in the form of something happening to you, but rather nothing happening to you. It just gives you overall higher survivability through means of less suspicion. This does of course come with a downside, in that you'll pretty often find yourself stuck with a slower disguise, that of a heavier soldier for example, which can be a pain in the ass. A slower disguise means many things. You escape bad situations much slower, you can't catch up with any class faster than you, and of course things like trick stabs are much more tricky. You'll have to focus on rotation a lot more than movement. However, you can still make things work out in these situations, and sometimes because of how slow whichever class you're disguised as is, it can be a lot more convincing to enemies. It's also important to note that it's often very worth it to just drop your disguise sometimes if you're chasing an enemy. Anyway, with that aside, it's time to talk about the really cool shit. Alright, so to me, this weapon's true strengths come from two specific stats for two very particular reasons. The Silent Killer perk and instant disguises on backstabs. We'll start with the first. Silent kills on every backstab or butter knife is absolutely integral to the function of this weapon. At first, it just seems like a simple stat to help make it more stealth-oriented, allowing you to pick off enemies without them knowing. This is of course a strength of the weapon. Being able to kill that random sniper, engineer, anyone without making a ton of noise is only to your benefit. However, I believe the true strength of the silent backstabs is as follows. Oi, don't laugh, my friends. Dude, this knife is so fucking good. You just get to stab people one after the other. They don't do anything. It's so consistent. Keep the word chain stab in mind. It's going to be relevant for the rest of this entire video from here on out. It's this weapon that makes you realize that sound is so fucking important when playing Spy. It makes it very clear how much it impacts you when you're using any other weapon. Any experienced player is immediately going to hear that noise and turn around, which can be dangerous given humans can typically react faster to the sound than they can to sight. And with many other power classes such as heavies, soldiers, pyros, or demos, it doesn't really matter if they're 100% accurate. They hear a backstab behind them, they're gonna turn around and press mouse 1. Pyro and soldier especially get you a lot with this method, and it's a pain to deal with. It requires you to instantly escape with your cloak or some really good footwork to trick stab them. With no sound, however, on your backstabs, it is often impossible for this to be an issue for you. Maybe you'll break a medic's healing beam, or voice communication will come into play, but these are very far from foolproof methods. A healing beam being broken can be a red flag sometimes, but 90% of the time it's just because the medic decided to heal someone else for a second, so it's not always going to set a player off. Even communication as well is very far from guaranteed in any non-competitive setting, and even in a competitive setting, any communication is always going to be significantly slower than simply the sound of a backstab alerting an enemy. Of course, I'm not a competitive spy, and I know for a fact this thing is pretty mediocre in those settings, but I do want to note that this thing isn't nearly as worthless as you might think there. Even with strong communication, however, there's one more strength that the YER has up its sleeve: instant disguises. Let's say you're leading a push into a dangerous area. You aren't immediately in the midst of things, but you're getting ready to push in and ready to shoot whatever pops up. Then you hear this over the voice chat out of nowhere. Hearing this, you turn around. Now tell me instantly, who's the spy? Now let's consider everything you'd have to do to figure it out. Sometimes a teammate will instead shout, this can sometimes clue you in who to shoot, or you might hear the voice of a teammate who you know is playing medic, for example. There's a few different methods, but they all share the same issue. You're still left to connect the dots. Even if right now in this picture it seems obvious what you should do, this is a split second in time, and you need to act fast before anything else happens. The extra time it takes your brain to process all the information you need to both deduce and attack the spy, that's time entirely given to the spy to do whatever he wants with. He can either escape or go for more stabs, especially the latter if other teammates are around. It's a complex piece of theory, but the important point to get across here is this: you will react infinitely faster to just seeing an enemy spy on your screen when compared to having to use communication or context clues to figure things out. The latter of which is the exact situation the YER puts you in. This is an incredibly powerful ability, as when you're playing Spy, having even just a tiny bit more leniency is super useful. You're an all or nothing class. Having just a half second more could easily mean another pick or enough time to escape with your life. Not to mention, and honestly I don't know where else to put this, but you still have 125 health. It's not a lot compared to the other classes, but to some of their knives, it does give you a bit of staying power, which can come into play pretty often when it comes to getting an important pick, so there's that too. Anyway, this combination of silent backstabs and instant disguises makes the YER an absolute beast at chain stabs. In fact, I would argue that this might just be the best chain stab knife in the game, especially so in pubs. This is somewhat of a hot take for the sake of being a hot take, but I do think it's severely overshadowed in the community by the kunai and the big earner. The kunai especially, having used the YER consistently for a few days now, it's crazy how much harder it can be to get multiple stabs in a row when people can hear every scream. Not even mentioning how horribly satisfying this knife is to use for this purpose. Getting multiple stabs in a row with no issue, no fighting back, no janky corners or body blocking, just stab after stab. I cannot understate how much more consistent this is. Even just a decent chance of enemies taking longer to turn around to notice you is so much more consistent than going for trick stabs with the kunai, the latter of which you will still die with easily if you get too stab hungry. I'm making these comparisons to the kunai a lot because I think it's too often seen as the only choice in pubs. Is it still the best choice? Yeah, 100% it's the kunai, no shit. But the Eternal Reward I feel like I see way too rarely in comparison to how fun and effective it can be. It's changed a bit over the years, but what it is today is incredibly cool, except for that fucking 33% cloak drain rate. Valve can eat my spiny ass if they think they can fuck.